In the quiet hills of North Carolina during the 1970s, there lived a woman who seemed like an angel sent from heaven. Her name was Velma Barfield, and everyone in the small town knew her as the sweetest lady you could ever meet. She was 52 years old with soft gray hair that she always kept neat and tidy. Her gentle voice could calm a crying baby or comfort a worried family member. Velma wore simple flower print dresses that reached down to her knees. She carried a black leather purse that was worn from years of use. Inside that purse, she always kept a small Bible with pages that were yellow from being read so many times. The cover was cracked and held together with tape, but she treasured it like it was made of gold. Every Sunday morning, you could find Velma sitting in the third row of the Baptist church. She sang hymns in a soft voice that made other people want to sing louder. When the preacher asked for prayers, Velma was always the first to raise her hand. She prayed for sick neighbors, lonely widows, and anyone who needed help. People said she had the biggest heart in the county. But what made Velma truly special was how much she cared for old people. In those days, there were not many nursing homes in small towns. Families had to take care of their elderly relatives at home. This was hard work that required someone with patience and kindness. Velma seemed perfect for this job. When Mrs. Henderson down the street needed someone to help with her 80-year-old mother, she called Velma. When the Johnson family could not handle their grandfather who had forgotten how to take care of himself, they asked Velma to come live with them for a while. She never said no to anyone who needed help. Velma would arrive at these homes carrying a small suitcase with clean clothes and her medical supplies. She knew how to give medicine, help people take baths, and cook soft foods that were easy to swallow. She would sit by bedsides reading Bible stories in her calm voice. The families felt so lucky to have found someone like her. The old people seemed to love her too. She would brush their hair gently and tell them stories about her own life. She talked about her children and grandchildren. She shared memories of growing up on a farm where she learned to cook and clean and take care of everyone around her. Her laugh was soft like wind chimes on a summer day, but there were things about Velma that nobody knew. Inside her worn black purse next to her Bible was a small bottle of pills. The label said they were for pain, but Velma took them even when she did not hurt anywhere. She had been taking these pills for years and now she needed them just to feel normal. The pills made her think differently sometimes. They made her feel like she was floating above her problems. But when the pills wore off, reality came crashing back. She had bills to pay and debts that kept growing bigger. Her husband had died years ago, and the insurance money was almost gone. She worked hard taking care of other people, but it was never enough money. Sometimes late at night, when the old people she cared for were sleeping, Velma would sit in their kitchens and worry. She would look at their checkbooks lying on the counter. She would think about how easy it would be to write herself a check for the money she desperately needed. Just once, she told herself. Just enough to pay the electric bill. But once became twice, and twice became a habit. Velma learned to copy the handwriting of the old people she cared for. She became very good at signing their names on checks. She told herself it was okay because she worked so hard for them. She deserved a little extra money for all her kindness. The families never suspected anything. Why would they? Velma was so sweet and helpful. She cooked their favorite meals and made sure they took their medicine on time. She kept their houses clean and their laundry washed. She was like a gift from God during their most difficult times. In 1978, something happened that would change everything. Velma met a man named Stuart Taylor. He was a kind gentleman who had lost his wife the year before. Stuart was lonely, and Velma seemed like exactly what he needed in his life. They began spending time together, taking walks and sharing quiet dinners. Stuart lived in a small house with a garden where he grew tomatoes and green beans. He had enough money saved to live comfortably, and he was generous with the people he cared about. When he learned that Velma struggled with money, he wanted to help her. He offered to pay some of her bills, and even talked about them getting married someday. For a few months, Velma felt happier than she had in years. Stuart treated her like a lady and made her laugh. They would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and making plans for the future. He said he wanted to take care of her for the rest of their lives. But Velma's problems were bigger than Stuart knew. The pills she took every day cost more money than she could afford. She had been stealing from the families she worked for, and she lived in constant fear of getting caught. Even with Stuart's help, the debts kept piling up like leaves in autumn. Then in early 1978, Stuart started feeling sick. It began with stomach pains that came and went. He thought maybe he had eaten something that did not agree with him. But the pain got worse, and soon he was throwing up everything he tried to eat. His skin turned pale and he felt weak all the time. Velma was right there to take care of him. She made him special soups and brought him medicine from the drugstore. She stayed by his side day and night, making sure he was comfortable. Stuart's family thought he was lucky to have someone who cared so much about him. But Stuart kept getting sicker instead of better. The doctors could not figure out what was wrong with him. They ran tests and gave him different medicines, but nothing seemed to help. Stuart began to look like a ghost of the healthy man he used to be. As Stuart lay in his bed getting weaker each day, nobody noticed the small container that Velma kept in her purse next to her pills and her Bible. Nobody saw her adding a tiny bit of white powder to his soup each evening. Nobody suspected that the woman who seemed like an angel was slowly poisoning the man who loved her. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the entire community and reveal the dark truth about the woman they all trusted with their most precious loved ones. February 1978 was one of the coldest months anyone could remember in North Carolina. Snow covered the ground like a white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees at night. Inside Stuart Taylor's small house, something much colder than winter was happening. Stuart was dying and nobody knew why. Stuart had been sick for weeks now. What started as simple stomach pain had turned into something much worse. He could not keep any food down. His body shook with fever one minute and felt ice cold the next. His once strong hands now trembled when he tried to hold a cup of water. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man twice his age. Velma stayed with him every day and every night. She had moved a small chair next to his bed so she could watch over him while he slept. The sound of his breathing was shallow and difficult. Sometimes he would moan in his sleep, and Velma would gently touch his forehead and whisper prayers. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect caring girlfriend. The smell in Stuart's bedroom was a mix of medicine and sickness that never seemed to go away. Velma kept the windows closed because of the cold weather, so the air felt heavy and still. She burned candles that smelled like vanilla to try to make the room more pleasant, but underneath was always that smell of someone who was very ill. Every morning, Velma would go to Stuart's kitchen to make him something to eat. She knew he probably would not be able to keep it down, but she had to try. She would heat up chicken soup and add crackers that she crushed into tiny pieces. She would carry the bowl to his room on a wooden tray, walking slowly so nothing would spill. Stuart would try to eat a few spoonfuls to make Velma happy. He knew she was working so hard to take care of him. But within an hour, he would be rushing to the bathroom to throw up everything she had given him. Velma would clean up the mess without complaining and tell him that tomorrow would be better. The doctors at the county hospital were confused. They had run every test they could think of, but Stuart's blood work showed nothing unusual. His heart was fine, his lungs were clear, and there were no signs of cancer or other serious diseases. Yet he kept getting sicker every day. Dr. Williams, who had been Stuart's doctor for 20 years, scratched his head and admitted he did not know what was wrong. Stuart's sister Alice came to visit him during the worst week of his illness. She lived 2 hours away and had not seen him in several months. When she walked into his bedroom, she could not believe what she saw. Her strong, healthy brother had become a skeleton covered in pale skin. His eyes had dark circles around them, and his hair looked thin and lifeless. Alice noticed that Velma never seemed to leave Stuart's side. Even when Alice offered to watch him so Velma could go home and rest, Velma said she was fine staying there. She said Stuart needed her, and she could not bear to leave him alone when he was so sick. Alice thought this was very sweet, but something about it made her feel uncomfortable. On February 4th, 1978, Stuart died in his sleep. Velma was sitting in her chair next to his bed when she noticed that his breathing had stopped. She did not scream or cry out. Instead, she sat there for several minutes listening to the silence. Then she gently closed his eyes and called the doctor. The funeral was held 3 days later at the same Baptist church where Velma prayed every Sunday. The church was packed with people who had known Stuart his whole life. He had been a good man who helped his neighbors and never said bad things about anyone. People could not understand why God had taken him away so suddenly. Velma sat in the front row wearing a black dress that she had borrowed from a friend. She carried tissues in her hands and dabbed at her eyes throughout the service. When people came to tell her how sorry they were for her loss, she thanked them in a soft voice and said that Stuart was in a better place now. But while everyone was focused on saying goodbye to Stuart, Alice was thinking about other things. She had been going through Stuart's papers to help settle his affairs. What she found made her stomach feel sick. There were checks written in Stuart's name, but the handwriting looked different from usual. Money had been taken from his savings account in amounts that Stuart had never mentioned to anyone. Alice also found something else that bothered her. In Stuart's medicine cabinet, she discovered bottles of pills that she had never seen before. The labels said they were for Velma Barfield, not for Stuart. There were pain pills and nerve pills, more than any one person should need. Alice wondered why Velma's medicine was in Stuart's house and why there was so much of it. When Alice asked Velma about the missing money, Velma seemed surprised and hurt that anyone would question her. She explained that Stuart had given her permission to write checks when he was too sick to do it himself. She said he had wanted to help her pay some bills because he loved her and planned to marry her. Alice was not completely satisfied with this answer, but she did not know what else to do. The weeks after Stuart's funeral were quiet and sad. Velma went back to her own small apartment and tried to return to her normal life. But normal had become something different now. She had gotten used to having Stuart's money to help with her bills. Without him, her financial problems came rushing back like water through a broken dam. Velma started looking for more work taking care of elderly people. She put notices in the church newsletter and asked friends to spread the word that she was available to help families who needed someone to care for their aging relatives. People remembered how dedicated she had been to Stuart during his illness, and several families contacted her right away. But Alice could not stop thinking about her brother's death. She talked to other family members about the strange things she had found in Stuart's house. They began to remember other times when people close to Velma had died unexpectedly. There was Velma's own mother, who had died just 4 years earlier after a brief illness. There was her husband Thomas, who had died in 1971 when he was still relatively young and healthy. Alice decided to call Dr. Williams and ask him more questions about Stuart's death. She wanted to know if there was any chance that Stuart had been poisoned. Dr. Williams said that poisoning was possible, but they would need to do special tests to find out for sure. These tests were expensive and would require digging up Stuart's body from the cemetery. The idea of disturbing Stuart's grave made Alice feel sick to her stomach, but the idea that someone might have murdered her brother made her feel even worse. She talked to her family, and they decided they had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As winter turned into spring, Alice began making phone calls to lawyers and medical examiners. She was determined to find out what had really happened to Stuart. She did not know yet that her investigation would uncover one of the most shocking murder cases in North Carolina history, or that the sweet church lady who had cared for Stuart was actually a cold-blooded killer who had been poisoning people for years. Velma continued going to church every Sunday, singing hymns and praying for the souls of the departed. Nobody suspected that she was praying for forgiveness for crimes that would soon come to light and destroy the peaceful community forever. Spring arrived in North Carolina like a detective uncovering clues. The snow melted away, revealing things that had been hidden all winter long. Just like the changing season, the truth about Velma Barfield was slowly coming to light, and what people discovered would shake their small community to its very core. Alice Taylor could not sleep at night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her brother Stuart's pale face in those final weeks before he died. She kept thinking about the strange things she had found in his house. The medicine bottles with Velma's name on them, the checks written in handwriting that looked different from Stuart's usual writing, the missing money that nobody could explain. 3 months after Stuart's funeral, Alice made a decision that would change everything. She called the police and asked them to investigate her brother's death. Detective Ray Benson was assigned to the case. He was a tall man with gray hair who had been solving crimes in the county for over 20 years. He had seen many suspicious deaths, but something about this case made him pay extra attention. Detective Benson drove out to Stuart's house, which had been sitting empty since his death. The room still smelled like sickness and medicine. Dust covered the furniture and spiderwebs hung in the corners like nature was trying to reclaim the space. Benson walked through each room slowly, looking for anything that might give him answers. In the kitchen, he found something interesting. On a high shelf above the stove, there was a small container that Alice had missed when she cleaned out the house. The container was made of brown glass and had no label on it. Inside was a white powder that looked like flour or sugar. Detective Benson carefully put the container in a plastic bag to take back to the police station. Meanwhile, Velma had found a new job taking care of an elderly woman named Dolly Edwards. Mrs. Edwards was 76 years old and lived alone in a house that smelled like old roses and cats. She had trouble walking and needed someone to help her with cooking, cleaning, and taking her medicine. Velma seemed like the perfect person for this job. Mrs. Edwards lived on a small pension and the money her late husband had left her. She was very careful with her spending and kept her checkbook in a drawer next to her bed. She had told her daughter that she never wrote checks for more than $50 at a time, and she always wrote down every penny she spent in a small notebook. Velma moved into Mrs. Edwards' house in May 1978. She slept in the guest bedroom and cooked meals in the small kitchen. The house was quiet during the day, with only the sound of the old clock ticking in the living room and Mrs. Edwards' cat purring on the windowsill. Velma seemed to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere, and Mrs. Edwards was grateful to have such a kind companion. But Detective Benson was getting busy with his investigation. The white powder he had found in Stewart's kitchen was sent to a laboratory in the state capital. The scientists there ran special tests to find out what it was. What they discovered made Detective Benson's blood run cold. The powder was arsenic, a deadly poison that could kill someone slowly if given in small amounts over several weeks. Arsenic was the perfect murder weapon for someone like Velma. It had no smell and very little taste. It could be mixed into food or drinks without the victim knowing it was there. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning looked like many other illnesses, so doctors often did not think to test for it. A person could be murdered with arsenic, and everyone would think they had died of natural causes. Detective Benson knew he needed more evidence before he could arrest anyone. He decided to have Stewart's body dug up from the cemetery so doctors could test his organs for poison. This was called an exhumation, and it required special permission from a judge. The idea of disturbing Stewart's grave was terrible, but it was the only way to prove what had really happened to him. On a gray morning in July 1978, workers arrived at the cemetery with shovels and machines. Alice Taylor stood nearby with tears in her eyes as they dug up her brother's coffin. The smell of dirt and decay filled the air. It was one of the most awful things she had ever experienced, but she knew it had to be done. The doctors who examined Stewart's body found exactly what Detective Benson expected. There were high levels of arsenic in Stewart's liver, kidneys, and other organs. The amount was more than enough to kill a person. Stewart Taylor had not died of natural causes. He had been murdered by someone who fed him poison a little bit at a time until his body could not fight anymore. Now Detective Benson had proof that Stewart was murdered, but he still needed to find out who did it. He began looking into Velma's background more carefully. What he discovered was shocking. Over the past 7 years, several people close to Velma had died under mysterious circumstances. In 1971, Velma's husband, Thomas Burke, had died suddenly at the age of 50. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but Thomas had been healthy with no history of heart problems. In 1974, Velma's own mother had died after a brief illness that doctors could not explain. In 1976, Velma's mother-in-law had also died unexpectedly while Velma was taking care of her. Detective Benson requested that all of these bodies be dug up and tested for poison. The exhumations took place over several weeks during the hot summer of 1978. Each time, the results were the same. Every person had been killed with arsenic. Velma Barfield had been murdering people for years, and nobody had suspected her because she seemed so kind and caring. While the police were digging up graves and testing bodies, Velma was continuing her normal life. She went to church every Sunday and sang hymns in her soft voice. She took care of Mrs. Edwards during the day and read her Bible at night. She had no idea that Detective Benson was building a case against her that would soon change her life forever. Mrs. Edwards began having stomach problems in late July. She told Velma that her food was not agreeing with her lately. She felt nauseated after eating and had trouble keeping meals down. Velma was very concerned and offered to take Mrs. Edwards to see a doctor. She also began preparing special foods that would be easier for Mrs. Edwards to digest. But Mrs. Edwards' daughter noticed something strange when she came to visit. Her mother's checkbook showed several large payments to stores and companies that Mrs. Edwards said she had never heard of. When the daughter asked Velma about this, Velma explained that Mrs. Edwards had asked her to pay some bills and might have forgotten about them because of her age. Detective Benson was getting close to making an arrest. He had evidence that Velma had murdered at least 4 people with arsenic. He also had proof that she had been stealing money from her victims by forging their signatures on checks. The sweet church lady who everyone trusted was actually a serial killer who targeted the most vulnerable people in her community. On August 13, 1978, Detective Benson and 2 other officers drove to Mrs. Edwards' house. They found Velma in the kitchen making dinner. She was wearing a blue dress and had her hair pinned back neatly. When Detective Benson told her she was under arrest for murder, Velma did not scream or try to run away. Instead, she calmly set down the spoon she was holding and asked if she could get her purse. As the handcuffs clicked around Velma's wrists, Mrs. Edwards watched from her chair in the living room. She could not believe that the woman who had been taking such good care of her was actually trying to kill her. The house that had been so peaceful just minutes before now felt cold and frightening. The news of Velma's arrest spread through the community like wildfire. People could not believe that the woman they had trusted with their most precious family members was a cold-blooded killer. The foundations of trust that held their small town together had been shattered forever. The courthouse in Elizabethtown, North Carolina, had never seen anything like the trial of Velma Barfield. People lined up outside the building at dawn, hoping to get a seat inside to see the woman who had shocked their entire community. News reporters came from big cities to cover the story of the grandmother who had poisoned her own family members. The parking lot was full of cars and television trucks with tall antennas reaching toward the sky. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension and curiosity. The wooden benches were packed with people who had known Velma for years. Some had trusted her with their elderly relatives. Others had sat next to her in church and listened to her pray. Now they stared at her with a mixture of horror and disbelief, trying to understand how someone they thought they knew could have done such terrible things. Velma sat at the defendant's table wearing a simple navy blue dress that her lawyer had bought for her. Her gray hair was neatly combed and she wore small gold earrings that caught the light from the courtroom windows. In her hands, she held the same worn Bible that she had carried for years. The pages were still yellow, and the cover was still cracked, but now it seemed different somehow, like a prop in a play rather than a source of real comfort. The prosecutor was a serious man named Joe Freeman Britt. He was known throughout North Carolina for being tough on criminals, especially those who hurt innocent people. When he stood up to give his opening statement, the courtroom became so quiet you could hear people breathing. He told the jury that they would hear evidence proving that Velma Barfield was not the sweet Christian woman she pretended to be, but a cold-blooded killer who used poison to murder people who trusted her. Velma's defense lawyer was a kind older man named Bob Jacobson. He had known Velma's family for many years and truly believed that she was not capable of murder. He told the jury that Velma was a victim herself, a woman who had become addicted to prescription drugs and made poor decisions while her mind was clouded by medication. He asked them to remember the good things Velma had done in her life, and to consider that she might not be responsible for her actions. Day after day, witnesses came to the stand to tell their stories. Alice Taylor testified about finding the strange medicine bottles in her brother Stuart's house. She spoke in a shaky voice about watching her healthy brother waste away and die, while Velma fed him soup and claimed to care for him. When she described the smell of sickness that had filled Stuart's bedroom, several people in the courtroom started crying. Dr. Williams, who had treated Stuart during his final illness, explained to the jury how arsenic poisoning worked. He said that small amounts of the poison given over time would cause exactly the symptoms that Stuart had experienced. The stomach pain, vomiting, weakness, and pale skin were all signs that someone was being slowly murdered with arsenic. The doctor's words made everyone in the courtroom understand just how cruel Velma's method of killing really was. The forensic experts who had tested the victims' bodies presented their findings. They showed charts and graphs that proved each person had died from arsenic poisoning. The levels of poison in their organs were so high that there was no doubt they had been murdered. When the experts explained that arsenic was tasteless and odorless, making it the perfect weapon for someone who wanted to kill without being detected, people in the courtroom gasped. For 2 years, Velma maintained her innocence. She testified in her own defense, speaking in the same soft voice that had comforted so many families over the years. She told the jury that she had never hurt anyone, and that she could not understand how poison had gotten into the victims' bodies. She claimed that she had loved Stuart and would never have done anything to harm him. She said the medicine bottles in his house belonged to her, but she had no idea how arsenic had gotten there. When Velma spoke about her faith, her voice became stronger and more confident. She quoted Bible verses from memory and talked about how God had been the center of her life since she was a young girl. She said that killing people would be a sin against everything she believed in. Some people in the courtroom found her testimony convincing, while others thought she was putting on an act. The trial lasted for months, with evidence presented bit by bit like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The jury learned about Velma's drug addiction and her desperate need for money to buy pills. They heard about the forged checks and stolen money that showed Velma was willing to commit crimes for financial gain. They saw photographs of the victims before and after they became sick, showing how healthy people had wasted away under Velma's care. But the most shocking moment came when Velma's own defense lawyer discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in Velma's personal belongings, investigators found a small notebook where she had written down details about each poisoning. The notebook contained dates, amounts of arsenic used, and observations about how quickly each victim was dying. It was like a recipe book for murder, written in Velma's own handwriting. When confronted with this evidence, something inside Velma finally broke. After years of claiming innocence, she asked to speak privately with her lawyer. In a small room behind the courtroom with tears streaming down her face, Velma finally told the truth. She admitted that she had killed Stuart Taylor, her mother, her husband, her mother-in-law, and 2 other people by putting arsenic in their food and drinks. Velma's confession was like opening a door that had been locked for years. Once she started talking, she could not stop. She explained how she had bought arsenic from farm supply stores, telling the clerk she needed it to kill rats. She described how she had mixed tiny amounts into soup, coffee, and medicine, giving it to her victims a little at a time so their deaths would look natural. The most chilling part of her confession was when Velma talked about watching her victims suffer. She said she had felt sorry for them, but she also felt powerful knowing that she controlled whether they lived or died. She admitted that she had sometimes given them extra poison when she got tired of taking care of them, or when she needed their money more urgently. When Velma's lawyer announced to the court that his client wanted to change her plea to guilty, the courtroom erupted in shocked voices and crying. People who had known Velma for decades could not believe what they were hearing. The sweet church lady had not only committed murder, but she had enjoyed watching people die slowly and painfully. The judge accepted Velma's guilty plea and scheduled her sentencing hearing for the following month. As court officers led Velma away in handcuffs, she turned to look at the people in the courtroom one last time. Some of them had been her friends and neighbors for years. Now they stared at her like she was a monster they had never seen before. Outside the courthouse, Alice Taylor spoke to the news reporters who had gathered to cover the story. She said she felt relieved that the truth had finally come out, but she also felt sick knowing how her brother had suffered in his final weeks. She said the hardest part was realizing that Stuart had trusted Velma completely, never suspecting that the woman who claimed to love him was slowly killing him with every meal she prepared. As word of Velma's confession spread through the community, people began to worry about other elderly relatives who had died while under her care. Families started asking questions about deaths they had never questioned before. The woman who had seemed like an angel of mercy had actually been an angel of death, and nobody knew how many victims she might have claimed over the years. The North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women was a place where hope went to die. The building was made of gray concrete blocks that looked cold, even in the summer heat. Tall fences topped with razor wire surrounded the facility like metal thorns. Guard towers stood at each corner, their windows reflecting the sun like watching eyes. This was where Velma Barfield would spend the last 6 years of her life, waiting to die for the murders she had committed. Velma's cell was small and narrow, barely wide enough for her to stretch out her arms. The walls were painted a dull green color that reminded her of hospital rooms. There was a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small metal toilet, and a tiny sink that dripped constantly. The only window was high up near the ceiling and covered with thick metal mesh. Through it, she could see a small patch of sky that changed color with the seasons but never offered any real comfort. The sounds of death row were unlike anything Velma had ever experienced. During the day, there were footsteps echoing in the corridors, the clanging of metal doors, and the voices of guards calling to each other. At night, the building became quieter, but sleep was often interrupted by the crying of other prisoners, the rattling of keys, or the sound of someone having a nightmare. The air always smelled like disinfectant mixed with fear and despair. Velma's daily routine was simple and unchanging. She woke up at 6 in the morning when the lights came on automatically. Breakfast was served through a slot in her cell door, usually oatmeal or eggs that had no taste and bread that was always slightly stale. She spent most of her day reading her Bible, writing letters, or talking to the prison chaplain who visited twice a week. The chaplain was a gentle man named Reverend Hugh Hoyle. He had gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When he first met Velma, he was not sure what to expect. He had heard about her crimes and knew that she had killed 6 people with poison. But when he sat across from her in the small visiting room, he saw a woman who seemed genuinely sorry for what she had done. Velma told Reverend Hoyle that she had found real faith while sitting in her cell. She said that before her arrest, she had gone to church and carried a Bible, but she had never truly understood what it meant to ask God for forgiveness. Now facing death, she claimed that she had finally given her heart completely to Jesus Christ. She spent hours each day praying and reading scripture, trying to make peace with God and with herself. Letters arrived for Velma almost every day. Some were from people who supported her and believed that she should not be executed. These letter writers said that Velma had changed and that killing her would not bring back her victims. They argued that life in prison was punishment enough for her crimes. Other letters came from people who were angry about what she had done. They called her evil names and said that she deserved to die for murdering innocent people who had trusted her. But the letters that hurt Velma the most came from family members of her victims. Stuart Taylor's sister Alice wrote to tell Velma how much pain she had caused their family. Alice described how Stuart's death had destroyed their trust in other people and made them afraid to let anyone new into their lives. She said that even though Stuart was gone, the family still suffered every day because of what Velma had done to him. Velma tried to write back to some of the victims' families. She wanted to tell them how sorry she was and ask for their forgiveness, but finding the right words was almost impossible. How do you apologize for slowly poisoning someone you claim to love? How do you ask forgiveness from people whose lives you have destroyed forever? Most of her letters went unsent, crumpled up and thrown away because she could not figure out what to say. As the years passed on death row, Velma's appearance began to change. Her gray hair turned completely white and became thin and brittle. Her face developed deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She lost weight because the prison food was poor and her appetite was often gone. Her hands, which had once been steady enough to mix poison into soup without spilling a drop, now shook when she tried to write letters or turn the pages of her Bible. Velma's lawyers worked hard to save her life. They filed appeal after appeal, arguing that she should not be executed because she was mentally ill or because she had been a victim of abuse herself. They brought in doctors who said that Velma's drug addiction had damaged her brain and made her unable to think clearly when she committed the murders. They pointed out that she had never killed anyone before she became addicted to prescription pills. The appeals process moved slowly through the courts. Each time a higher court agreed to review Velma's case, she felt a small spark of hope that her life might be saved. But each time the courts decided that her death sentence should stand, she sank deeper into despair. The waiting was almost worse than knowing she would die. Every day could be her last. but she never knew which one it would be. Other prisoners on death row came and went during Velma's time there. Some had their sentences changed to life in prison. Others were executed on schedule. Velma watched as women she had gotten to know were taken away to die, and she wondered when her turn would come. The uncertainty made every day feel like a gift and a curse at the same time. Velma began to have nightmares about her victims. In her dreams, she would see Stuart Taylor standing in his kitchen, asking her why she had put poison in his coffee. She would see her own mother reaching out to her, wondering why her daughter had killed her. Sometimes she would wake up screaming, and the guards would come to check on her. She would tell them she was fine, but inside she felt like she was slowly going crazy. In 1984, after 6 years of appeals and legal battles, the courts made their final decision. Velma Barfield would be executed by lethal injection on November 2, 1984. When her lawyer told her the news, Velma sat quietly for several minutes without saying anything. Then she asked if she could have some time alone to pray. As the execution date approached, Velma's behavior became calmer and more peaceful. She told visitors that she had made her peace with God and was ready to die for her crimes. She said that she hoped her death would bring some comfort to the families of her victims. She spent her final weeks writing letters to people she cared about and trying to prepare herself spiritually for what was coming. The last month of Velma's life was filled with visitors. Reporters wanted to interview her about her crimes and her time on death row. Religious leaders came to pray with her and talk about forgiveness and redemption. Anti-death penalty activists tried to convince her to make statements that would help their cause. Through it all, Velma remained focused on her faith and her claim that she had truly changed. On November 1, 1984, the day before her scheduled execution, Velma was moved to a special cell closer to the death chamber. The walls were painted white instead of green, and there was a small window that looked out onto a courtyard. She could see trees and grass for the first time in years. The sight of nature made her cry, partly from beauty and partly from sadness that she would never see another sunrise. That night, Velma did not sleep. She spent the hours reading her Bible and writing final letters to people she loved. She wrote to her children, asking them to forgive her for the shame she had brought to their family. She wrote to Reverend Hoyle, thanking him for helping her find real faith during her darkest time. As dawn approached on November 2, 1984, Velma Barfield prepared to meet her death and face whatever judgment awaited her on the other side. November 2, 1984 dawned cold and gray in North Carolina. Fog hung low over the trees surrounding the prison, making the world look ghostly and unreal. Inside the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, preparations were being made for something that had not happened in the state for 40 years. Velma Barfield would become the first woman executed in North Carolina since 1944, and her death would mark the end of one of the most shocking murder cases in the state's history. Velma woke up before dawn on her final day. She had not slept much during the night, spending most of the dark hours reading her Bible and praying. When the prison chaplain came to see her at 6 in the morning, he found her sitting calmly on her narrow bed, already dressed in the simple blue dress that the prison had provided for her execution. Her white hair was neatly combed, and she had applied a small amount of lipstick, wanting to look dignified in her final moments. Outside the prison, groups of people had gathered to show their support for different sides of the death penalty debate. Some carried signs that said Velma deserved to die for her crimes. Others held candles and prayed for her soul, believing that executing her was wrong no matter what she had done. News reporters set up cameras and microphones, preparing to broadcast the story of Velma's execution to people across the country. At 10 in the morning, Velma was allowed to have her last meal. She had requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and apple pie. The food was prepared in the prison kitchen and brought to her cell on a metal tray. She ate slowly and quietly, savoring each bite. The taste of real food reminded her of Sunday dinners with her family years ago, before drugs and desperation had turned her into a killer. Velma spent her final hours receiving visitors who had come to say goodbye. Her daughter came first, crying as she hugged her mother through the bars of the visiting room. Velma told her daughter that she was sorry for all the pain she had caused the family, and asked her to remember the good times they had shared before everything went wrong. Her son also came, finding it hard to look at the woman who had raised him, but who had also become a murderer. Reverend Hoyle stayed with Velma throughout the day, reading Bible verses and praying with her. She told him that she felt ready to meet God and face judgment for her sins. She said that she hoped her victims would be waiting for her in heaven so she could apologize to them personally. The chaplain was amazed by how calm and peaceful Velma seemed, almost as if she were going to sleep rather than to her death. At 2 in the afternoon, the prison warden came to Velma's cell to read her the official death warrant. His voice was formal and cold as he explained that she had been sentenced to die by lethal injection for the murder of Stuart Taylor and others. Velma listened quietly, nodding when he finished. She thanked him for treating her with respect during her time in prison and asked him to tell the guards that she appreciated their kindness. As evening approached, Velma was moved to a holding cell next to the death chamber. The room was small and white, with no decorations except for a cross hanging on the wall. Through a small window, she could see protesters outside holding their signs and candles. Some were singing hymns, while others chanted slogans about justice and revenge. The sound of their voices drifted through the walls like the buzzing of angry bees. At 2 in the morning on November 3rd, prison officials came to escort Velma to the execution chamber. She walked slowly down a long hallway lined with guards, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. She carried her worn Bible in her hands and whispered prayers as she walked. The execution chamber was a small room with bright white lights and a metal table in the center where she would spend her final moments. The execution team strapped Velma to the table and inserted needles into her arms. The process was clinical and efficient, designed to be as painless as possible. Velma was allowed to make a final statement to the witnesses who had gathered to watch her die. Her voice was steady as she spoke about her faith in God and her hope that her death would bring peace to the families of her victims. At 2:15 a.m., the lethal injection began to flow into Velma's veins. The first drug made her unconscious within seconds. The second drug stopped her breathing. The third drug stopped her heart. At 2:18 a.m., the prison doctor checked for vital signs and pronounced Velma Barfield dead. The woman who had poisoned 6 people with arsenic was gone, killed by chemicals flowing through her own bloodstream. News of Velma's execution spread quickly across North Carolina and beyond. Television reporters announced her death on the morning news, describing her as a grandmother who had become a serial killer. Newspapers printed stories about her crimes and her final hours, trying to help readers understand how someone who seemed so normal could have done such terrible things. The families of Velma's victims had different reactions to her execution. Alice Taylor, Stuart's sister, said she felt relieved that justice had finally been served. She said that knowing Velma was dead helped her sleep better at night, though it could never bring back her brother or erase the pain of his murder. Other family members said they felt empty rather than satisfied, realizing that Velma's death could not undo the damage she had caused. In the weeks following the execution, investigators continued to look into other mysterious deaths that might have been connected to Velma. They wondered if there were more victims who had never been discovered. Several families came forward with suspicions about elderly relatives who had died while under Velma's care. However, without bodies to examine or clear evidence of poisoning, these cases remained unsolved mysteries. The case of Velma Barfield changed how people in North Carolina thought about caring for elderly relatives. Families became more careful about who they hired to help with aging parents and grandparents. Background checks became more common, and people started paying closer attention to the financial records of elderly family members who needed caregivers. Medical professionals also learned important lessons from Velma's crimes. Doctors became better at recognizing the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and other types of slow-acting toxins. Hospitals developed new procedures for testing patients who showed unexplained symptoms, especially if those patients were being cared for by hired helpers or family members with access to their food and medicine. The story of Velma Barfield became a cautionary tale that people told to warn others about the dangers of trusting the wrong person. She had used people's natural desire to help and care for others as a weapon against them. Her victims had died, not because they were careless or foolish, but because they had shown kindness to someone who repaid that kindness with murder. Years after Velma's execution, People in her community still talked about her crimes. Some remembered her as a monster who had fooled everyone with her fake religious behavior. Others wondered if she might have been saved if someone had helped her overcome her drug addiction before it led to murder. Most people agreed that her story showed how addiction and desperation could turn an ordinary person into a killer. The small Baptist church where Velma had prayed every Sunday for years struggled to understand what had happened. Some members left the church, feeling that their faith had been tainted by association with a murderer. Others decided to stay and work harder to help people in their community who were struggling with addiction and financial problems, hoping to prevent another tragedy like Velma's crimes. Today, the name Velma Barfield is remembered as a warning about the dangers that can hide behind a friendly smile and a helping hand. Her story reminds us that evil sometimes wears the mask of kindness, and that the people we trust most with our lives might be the ones who pose the greatest threat to our safety. The woman who seemed like an angel turned out to be a demon, and her legacy serves as a permanent reminder that appearances can be deadly deceiving. The poisoner is gone, but the poison of her crimes continues to affect the lives of survivors and their families. Her story will be told for generations as a reminder that trust, once broken by betrayal and murder, can never be completely repaired. In the end, Velma Barfield got what she gave to others, death by poison flowing through her veins, but the damage she caused to her community and to the concept of trust itself will last forever.